A dark romance series. The Monster Who Owned Me. Part 7. The Women Who Stayed. There is a kind of courage that has no audience. It does not announce itself. It simply keeps showing up, day after day, in the rooms where it is needed. Chapter 1. Sophia in the Atrium. Violet, opening day, February. She was not what I expected. I don't know what I'd built in my mind from the fragments I'd assembled. The year of Adrian at 26. The 6 months of harm that was real even without malice. The 8 years of distance and rebuilding, and a life chosen fully on the other side. Whatever I'd imagined, the woman standing in front of me in the atrium of Kane Tower was something more specific and more human than imagination could construct. She was perhaps 35. Dark hair, shorter now than in the photographs Adrian had shown me from when they were together. A face that had the quality I'd come to associate with people who had been through something real and had arrived at the other side not hardened but clarified, the particular openness of someone who has stopped spending energy on pretending. She was looking at the installation when I approached her. Not at me yet, at the beams, the glass, the light doing its slow, alive work in the atrium air. The expression on her face was something I recognized, the expression of a person in the presence of a thing that is more than they expected. "Sophia," I said. She turned. She looked at me with the direct, assessing gaze of someone who has been thinking about this meeting for longer than the conversation that prompted it. "Violet," she said, "I know who you are. Adrian described you." "What did he say?" A brief, complicated expression, not quite a smile, not quite its absence. He said, "She is the person who knew how to listen to what the materials were saying." He was talking about the installation, but I don't think he was only talking about the installation. We looked at each other for a moment. Two women who had, in very different ways and at very different times, been inside the specific experience of Adrian Kane's attention. There was something between us that was not competition and not sisterhood exactly, something more specific than either, the particular recognition of two people who share a reference point that very few others have access to. "Your statement," I said, "it was honest." "It was the version I was able to write," she said. "After 8 years, I couldn't have written it at 2 years or 4. At those distances it would have been more ragged. This version has the benefit of time." "Are you all right?" I asked, having done it publicly. She considered the question with genuine attention. "I'm better than I expected to be," she said. "I thought it would feel like reopening something. It felt more like closing a chapter properly. The difference between a door left ajar and a door you've decided to close." I thought about doors, about the architecture of this building and all its unlocked and locked floors, about what it meant to close things properly. "He's not the same," I said. It came out simply because it was simply true. Not as a defense and not as a diminishment of what had happened to her. Both of those would have been insults to her intelligence. Just the fact. "I know," she said. "I wouldn't have come if I didn't believe that." She looked back at the installation. He couldn't have commissioned this at 26. He wasn't capable of it. Not because he was bad at 26. Because this requires something he didn't have yet. "What does it require?" She was quiet for a moment, looking at the light through the old glass. "The ability to let someone else do the most important thing," she said. "To trust another person with the thing that matters most. He couldn't do that. He could only do it himself because doing it himself was the only form of control he trusted." A pause. He had to let you make it. He had to tell you what it meant, and then step back and trust you to understand, and to make something truer than he could have directed you toward. I stood in the atrium under the installation I had made from his mother's building and thought about that. About the 16 weeks of being given a studio and materials and access and the specific quality of his attention, and then being trusted, genuinely, without management, to make the thing itself. "He does it differently now," I said. "Imperfectly, with backslides, but differently." "I'm glad," she said, simply, without complexity, without the weight of unresolved feeling. "Just glad, the way you are glad for something that has no longer anything to do with you, but that you can wish well." "Thank you for coming," I said. "Thank you for making this," she said, looking up at the installation. "And for being the person who stayed, for the right reasons." We stood in the atrium together for a little while. The light moved through the old glass. 300 people moved through the space around us and looked up and felt something they might not have had words for. Then Sophia said she needed to catch a flight, and I walked her to the lobby, and she shook my hand with the specific warmth of someone who means the gesture, and she left. I stood in the lobby for a moment after she'd gone. I thought, there are the people who were here before, and the people who are here now, and the people who will be here after, and the question is not which category you're in. The question is whether you were honest in it. I thought she had been. I thought we all were trying to be. I went back to the atrium. Chapter 2. The afternoon of the opening. Violet. By 4 o'clock, 600 people had come through. I know this because Nora tracked it. Nora tracked everything, and told me at intervals with the specific combination of professional efficiency and barely contained satisfaction that was her version of celebration. She had been in this building for 8 years. She had watched it take shape and watched the project take shape, and had, I understood now, been quietly managing the conditions for this day for longer than she'd ever said. The architectural registry confirmation came through at 2, she said, appearing at my elbow in the atrium with the legal pad that was her constant companion. The documentation filing has been received and acknowledged by the National Trust. The 4 publications ran the Cresswell piece simultaneously at noon as planned. His legal team has been in contact with ours since 1:15. What are they saying? That their client is prepared to negotiate, she said, with an expression that indicated her assessment of the leverage involved. Good, I said. Mr. Kane is on the 42nd floor. He's been there since the documentation went public. He asked me to tell you, she paused, consulting the legal pad. He asked me to tell you that the 42nd floor is, quote, operational but not essential, and that you should come up when you're ready. I looked at her. He wrote that down, for you to read to me. He said it, Nora said. I wrote it down because I find his communications to you more interesting when I have the exact wording. I stared at her. Something that was entirely new crossed her face. Something that I realized, with a small internal shock, was Nora Ellis allowing herself to be amused. You like us, I said. I am professionally invested in the project, she said, with the composure of someone reclaiming their register. And personally, I have worked for Adrian Kane for 8 years. I have wanted him to be happy for approximately 8 years. I have a professional investment in conditions that make that more likely. She walked away. I looked after her for a moment. Then I looked up at the installation. The light at 4 in the afternoon doing what 4 o'clock light in February did. Low and golden and specific. The old glass fracturing it into its components and scattering them across the atrium floor in patterns that were already different from the morning's patterns. Living, I thought, the way his mother said the light at the crest was living. I took the elevator to 42. He was at the window. Of course he was at the window. But when I came in, he turned immediately. Not the slow turn of someone who'd heard the door and was deciding whether to acknowledge it, but the immediate, full turn of someone who had been waiting for a specific person and had been alert to the sound of their arrival. He looked different, not relieved, exactly. The word I kept coming back to was lighter. The specific lightness of a person who has set down something they've been carrying for so long they'd forgotten the weight was optional. The window behind him showed the city in its February afternoon, cold and clear, the light at this height doing something extraordinary with the winter air. The kind of visibility that only comes with cold, that has chased the haze away. Sophia came, I said. I know, Nora told me. A pause. How was it? Good, I said. Honest. She said your ability to trust someone with the thing that matters most is what made the installation possible. That at 26 you couldn't have commissioned it because you couldn't have stepped back. He was quiet for a moment. She's right. I know. I moved to the window and stood beside him. The city was very clear below us. Cresswell is negotiating. Yes, his lawyers have been calling since 1. What do you want from the negotiation? He turned to look at me. The Crest site. I want the demolition halted and the property transferred, not to me, to a preservation trust that will maintain it. You think he'll give it? I think the documentation makes the alternative more costly than the concession, he said. Yes, I think he'll give it. I thought about the building upstate, the low roof lines, the winter trees, the rooms full of his mother's specific understanding of light and material, and the relationship between buildings and the people who live inside them. The room with the old glass windows, the study with the drawings. She'll have her building, I said. Yes, his voice was very quiet. She'll have her building. We stood at the window for a while. The city did its city things below, the perpetual motion of 8 million lives, the lights beginning to come on as the February afternoon tipped toward evening, the river catching the last of the day's light to the west. The installation, he said. You stood in it this morning. I did. What does it feel like, from the outside? I thought about how to answer. It feels like the thing I was trying to make, I said, which almost never happens. Usually the finished thing and the intended thing are different. The making introduces variables, compromises, the gap between what you imagined and what the materials will do. This one, I paused. This one is what I was reaching for, which means either I got very lucky or the materials themselves knew what they were supposed to say. The materials knew, he said. I think so, I said. He put his arm around me, which was something he did now with the ease of someone who has stopped requiring permission for the ordinary expressions of love. Not possessively. I want to be precise about that, because the distinction mattered, because I had been watching for it and still watched. Easily. The way you put your arm around someone who has chosen to be beside you and whose presence there is a fact rather than a management. I leaned into him. The city spread below. The installation was 6 floors beneath us, doing what it did. Alina was on the 17th floor, painting the crest from memory, the canvas almost finished. Nora was somewhere in the building with her legal pad. Sophia was on a plane back to Portland. The story was not over. It was not the kind of story that ends. But this chapter, this specific chapter, with its 15 years and its basements and its locked floors and its wrong elevators, this chapter was arriving at whatever came after. I pressed a wrong elevator button and walked into a room I wasn't supposed to be in. I thought it was the right room. I thought it was always the right room. Chapter 3. What Nora knows. Nora, the same evening. She had worked for Adrian Kane for 8 years. In 8 years, she had managed his calendar, his correspondence, his crisis communications, his board relationships, his legal scheduling, and the particular human complexity of a man who was exceptional at nearly everything and constitutionally unable to ask for help. She had managed the Crest documentation in the basement without being asked to manage it, and without ever referencing the fact that she knew it existed. She had managed floor 17 with the discretion that the situation required and the specific decency that Alina deserved. She had managed Varden's information leak, the journalist's investigation, the Sophia situation, and the Cresswell escalation with the competence of someone who had been quietly excellent for 8 years and had never once required recognition for it. She sat now in her office on the 35th floor with the building quiet around her and the legal pad closed on the desk and the city doing its evening things outside the window. And she allowed herself, for the first time today, for perhaps the first time in months, to simply be still. The documentation was filed. The Crest negotiation was in motion. The installation had opened. 600 people had stood in the atrium today and looked up at the thing a woman named Violet Hayes had made from the materials of a building that had been slowly being taken apart for 15 years, and something had happened to their faces while they looked, the specific softening of people in the presence of something that is genuinely true. Nora had watched 50 faces today. She had made a practice of watching faces in atria and lobbies and corridors, the expressions people wore when they thought no one was watching, which were almost always the most honest. 50 faces looking up at old glass and salvaged beams and light that had memory. She thought about the first day she'd met Adrian Kane. She had been 32, recently divorced, newly arrived at the interview with the specific determination of someone who had decided to be very good at something, because being good at something was the most reliable form of control she had access to. He had interviewed her himself, no HR, no intermediary, and the interview had been 45 minutes of the kind of questions that weren't looking for rehearsed answers. Questions about what she thought, what she'd do in specific situations, what she believed about the relationship between loyalty and honesty when they were in conflict. She had said, loyalty that requires dishonesty is not loyalty, it is complicity. He had hired her the next day. 8 years. She had not regretted it. She had not regretted it even in the years when she understood the weight of what floor 17 contained, and the basement room, and the specific loneliness of a man who had decided to carry everything himself because he did not trust anyone else with the weight. She had not regretted it because she understood that kind of loneliness, the loneliness of someone who is very capable and has learned, through specific experience, that capability is not enough protection against the harm that other people can do. She had watched Violet Hayes arrive in this building, and she had watched the building change around her arrival. Not dramatically, nothing about Violet was dramatic in the performed sense, but structurally. The way a material changes the load-bearing capacity of a structure it's added to, not by replacing what was there, but by distributing the weight differently. She thought about I'd put that away if I were you. The photograph, the warning she'd offered without quite offering, the folder left open on her desk on a specific Tuesday morning. She had not been careless with that folder. She thought, some things need to find their own way to the surface. You can only make sure the conditions are right. She picked up her legal pad, made 3 notes about tomorrow's schedule, set it back down. In the atrium below, the installation was doing what it did in the evening, the light lower, the glass catching the building's ambient illumination and doing something different with it than it did with natural light. She knew because she'd gone down to look at 8 o'clock, when the building was nearly empty. She had stood in the atrium alone and looked up for a long time. She had thought about Marguerite Kane, who had built the crest with salvaged materials because she believed that things carried the memory of the spaces they'd inhabited. Who had died before she could see what her son would do with that belief? She had thought, she would have known, she would have understood exactly what this is. She turned off her desk lamp, stood, put on her coat with the automatic efficiency of someone who has been ending workdays for 8 years in this building. At the door of her office, she stopped and looked back, at the desk, the legal pad, the window with the city beyond it. 8 years of knowing the weight of things and choosing, every day, to come back. She thought, tomorrow the Crest negotiation will advance. Tomorrow the legal team will have Cresswell's counter-proposal. Tomorrow the installation will have its second day of public witness. She thought, tomorrow Adrian Kane will wake up in a building that has finally done what he built it to do, and the woman who made that happen will be in it with him, and Alina will be on the 17th floor in remission, and the basement room will still exist, but its contents will no longer be a secret. She thought, this is what it looks like when things go right. She turned off the light and went home. Chapter 4. Marth. Violet, 6 weeks later. The Crest negotiation concluded in the 3rd week of March. Cresswell signed the transfer agreement on a Thursday afternoon, which Adrian called me from the 42nd floor to tell me. His voice in the particular register I'd come to identify as the register of things that were too large for the controlled tone to fully contain, even, steady, but with something enormous moving just beneath the surface. The property transfers to the Preservation Trust on April 1st, he said. The demolition order is formally withdrawn. The trust will manage the building's restoration and public access. I was in the studio. The installation project was officially complete. The fabrication team had signed off. The structural certification was done. The public program was running. But I came to the studio anyway, most days. Not to work, or not only. Because the room had become mine over 6 months in a way that spaces become yours when you've made something true inside them. The Crest, I said. The Crest, he confirmed. I sat down on the studio floor, the wide-planked hardwood that had held the weight of everything over 6 months, and looked out the windows at the city. Adrian. I know, he said. His voice was very quiet. She has her building. The silence that followed was the kind that has been earned. Yes, he said, she has her building. I thought about a woman who had built with salvage because she believed that things carried memory, who had stood in the room with the old glass windows and looked at the winter trees and made something that was, by any measure, an act of love, who had died at 53 and left a drawing and a son who spent 15 years making sure she wasn't made nothing. She was not made nothing. Come down, I said. Come to the studio. He came. He sat on the studio floor beside me, the floor we'd eaten on, the floor I'd slept near, the floor that had held 6 months of the work and everything that grew up around it. He sat and I leaned against him, and we looked out at the city through the floor-to-ceiling windows in the late March afternoon light, which was different from November's light, warmer, the city beginning to remember that spring was possible. We didn't speak for a long time. We didn't need to. Some things complete themselves. Elena's full remission was confirmed in the last week of March. Not partial, not provisional. Full, the word the oncologist used with the particular care of someone who has been cautious for 18 months and has finally, provisionally but substantially, run out of reasons to be cautious. She told us in her room on the 17th floor. She had set the table, actually set it, the small table she'd asked to have moved into the studio space, with the coffee and the cups and a plate of something she'd made, which was new, Elena cooking being another of the signs of the return of energy that we'd been nodding and not wanting to note too loudly. She told us, and then she looked at us both with the expression I'd come to know as her version of enormous feeling, contained, precise, the feeling present but not performed, and said, I want to go outside. The sentence was very simple. It had been 8 months since she'd been outside. 8 months of floor 17 and the small kitchenette and the window that looked at the city she could not enter. The medical team's protocols had kept her contained through the treatment, through the collapse, through the adjusted protocols and the slow recovery. Full remission changed the protocols. When? Adrian asked. Now, she said. We went outside. It was a Tuesday afternoon in late March, the kind of afternoon the city produces occasionally in this season. The cold mostly gone, the warmth not yet reliable, a day that exists in the border territory between what winter was and what spring is going to be. Elena came out of the building in the coat Adrian had apparently ordered for her at some point. She did not ask how he had known her size, which I noted as another of the small attentions that were structural in him, done without announcement, and she stood on the sidewalk outside Kane Tower and looked at the street. She did not say anything for a long time. She simply stood and looked at the street, at the people moving past, at the cars, at the buildings across the way, at the sky above the towers, at the ordinary Tuesday afternoon of New York going about its business with the magnificent indifference that was one of the city's most reliable qualities. Her face was, I don't have the right word for it, not joy, though joy was in it, not relief, though relief was in it, something more elemental, the expression of a person re-entering the world and finding it still there. We walked for an hour. Not far, 3 blocks, the deliberate short distance of the first outing, the reintroduction. She stopped at the coffee cart on 9th Avenue, which was Yusuf's cart, which was where I had been photographed in October by an investigator Adrian hadn't yet fully controlled. Yusuf looked at her, and then at me, and then made 3 coffees without being asked, with the extra sugar he always gave me, and the particular attentiveness of someone who understands that some moments require witnessing. Elena held her coffee with both hands. She looked at the street. She said, I forgot what cold air tastes like. What does it taste like? I asked. She considered it. Itself, she said, just exactly itself. Adrian stood beside us on the pavement outside the coffee cart, and I don't know what his face looked like in that moment because I didn't look at him. I was watching Elena, watching the street through her eyes, watching the re-entry. But I felt his hand find mine in the way it found mine when something was large and he needed the contact, and I held it, and the three of us stood on 9th Avenue in the late March afternoon and drank our coffee. Just exactly itself. Chapter 5. The first trip to the crest. Violet, April. Elena came to the crest in April. This was her idea, which surprised no one who knew her. The Preservation Trust had taken formal possession of the property on April 1st, and the restoration assessment team was scheduled for the second week of the month, and Elena had looked at the calendar on Adrian's desk. She had been in the penthouse twice now, coming upstairs for the first time with the specific care of someone testing the boundaries of their own recovered mobility, and finding that the boundaries had moved considerably, and said, "I want to go." The drive was 3 of us in the gray car, Adrian driving, Elena in the passenger seat, because she said the front was better for seeing the city give way to the countryside, which it was. I sat in the back and watched them from behind, the 2 people who had known each other longest, who had been through the most, who existed in the specific relationship of people who had been intimate, and then become something harder to name but more durable. Elena asked questions about the countryside as we drove. Not conversational questions, real ones, the questions of a painter. What made the particular quality of the light at this latitude? Why the bare spring trees had that specific gray-silver tone? What kind of stone the old walls were made of? Adrian answered with the encyclopedic specificity I recognized as his mode of caring, giving her everything he knew about what she asked, which was a form of taking her seriously, which was itself a form of love. I watched them and thought, this is also what he is. Not only the controlled surface and the basement rooms and the 15-year plans, also this, a man who answers questions completely because he respects the person asking. The crest was different in April than it had been in November. The bare trees were still bare, spring came late at this latitude, but there was something different in the quality of the property, something that might have been imagination but felt real. The difference between a place waiting to be demolished and a place waiting to be restored. The same stone, the same roof lines, the same windows with their old glass, but the weight of the demolition order gone from it. Elena got out of the car and stood looking at it for a long time. She had known Marguerite Kane only through what she'd heard from Adrian, the stories, the philosophy, the specific way she'd talked about buildings as language. She was standing now in front of the building that had been Marguerite's highest statement, the thing she'd made in her own voice with her own hands and her own principles. "It's her," Elena said quietly. "Yes," Adrian said. "I can see her in it, the way she thought." "Yes." Elena turned to look at him. Her expression was the full, uncomplicated warmth that appeared more often now, the warmth of someone who has survived something and arrived at a place where the things that are good are simply good, without the weight of everything else pressing against them. "She would have loved you," Elena said. "Your mother, the person you have become." Something moved through his face, enormous, briefly uncontained. He looked at the building. He looked at Elena. He looked at me. He didn't say anything. Some things don't have the right words. We walked the building together. Elena moved through the rooms with the painter's eye, the eye that reads space as light and volume and the relationship between them. She stopped longest in the room with the floor-to-ceiling windows, the room I'd stood in November, the room whose glass I'd taken into the installation, the room that had his mother's light. "This is the room in the painting," she said. "You recognized it," Adrian said. "I painted it from your descriptions, from his," she looked at me, "from both of your descriptions, but the light is," she stopped. "The light is what it is. You cannot describe light. You can only be in it." We were in it. The 3 of us in the room with the old glass and the spring afternoon coming through it, the light doing what old glass does with light, bending it, fracturing it, giving it back with the specific quality of something that has been touched and changed. I thought about the installation in the atrium of Kane Tower, doing the same thing with the same glass. His mother's building inside his building, the letter inside the other letter. I thought, this is what we made, not just the installation. This, the 3 of us in this room. I'm going to paint it again, Alina said. Properly, now that I've been in it. Good, Adrian said. It will take all summer. Good. I want to come back, regularly, to get it right. He looked at her. The trust will give you full access, as long as you want. She nodded. She looked at the window. The light moved. I put my hand in Adrian's. His fingers closed around mine with the ease of something that has become habitual, that has stopped requiring a decision, and become simply the way hands are when they're near each other. We stood in the room where his mother had thought about light and salvage and the memory that lives in old materials, and outside the spring was arriving, and the trees were beginning to remember what they were. Chapter 6. What he asks. Violet, the penthouse, April evening. He asked me on a Tuesday. Not dramatically. Not the way things are done in the public imagination of grand gestures. No restaurants, no coordinated arrangements, no audience. In the library, late evening, the fire lit, the drawing of the crest on the wall, the city doing its nighttime things beyond the window. The most ordinary version of the question, which was also the truest version. We had been talking about the summer, about the crest restoration timeline, about Alina's painting project, about a commission I'd been approached with in London that I was considering, about whether the consideration meant extended time away and what that would look like. I want you to live here, he said. It came out simply, the way his truest statements came, without preamble, without the management of affect, just the thing itself. I looked at him. Not, he paused, not as a possession, not as an arrangement I'm making for you, as a choice, your choice. I want you to know that I want it, and I want you to decide whether you want it and I'm not. He stopped. I'm aware of the history of me and significant decisions about other people's lives. I'm asking, I'm not arranging. I looked at him for a long moment. You're asking, I said. I'm asking. I thought about my apartment in Brooklyn. 3 rooms. The wolf-shaped water stain on the ceiling that I'd decided was lucky. The life I'd built in 4 years of solitude and work, and the deliberate self-sufficiency of someone who was choosing, every day, not to make herself smaller to fit into someone else's shape. I thought about this building, about the studio on 18 and the light, and the 7 months of making the best work of my life inside a space that had been given to me not as a gift, but as a trust. I thought about Alina on 17, painting the crest, painting the room with the old glass windows, coming back to herself in increments that were small and real, and nothing like the dramatic recovery of stories. I thought about the library we were in, with its worn chairs and its blanket and its drawing on the wall, and the city beyond the window that we looked at together now, which was different from the city looked at alone. I thought about 60%. I have conditions, I said. Something released in his face, the beginning of relief carefully managed. Tell me. The studio stays mine, not the building's, not shared, mine. No schedule changes without my agreement. The London commission, if I take it, I go to London. Alone or with you, depending on what works, but the work comes first. Yes, he said. I keep my Brooklyn apartment for 6 months, not as an escape, as an acknowledgement that this is a choice I'm making, not a door I'm closing. Yes. And you ask me things, I said. You don't arrange them, you ask every time. Every time, he said. I looked at him. At the face I had been reading for 7 months, the controlled surface and the unguarded thing underneath and all the gradations between, the face of someone who was learning himself in real time and doing it honestly. Yes, I said. He was quiet for a moment. Yes, you'll move in, or yes to the conditions. Both, I said. The real smile, the full one, the rare one, the one I kept. He crossed the room and held my face in his hands and looked at me with the enormous thing, all of it, the full measure, nothing managed or withheld. And I looked back with the same, and the library was warm and the city was beyond the window, and there was nothing, in this moment, that was not exactly what it was supposed to be. I love you, he said. I know, I said. I love you too. He kissed me. Not the first or the second or the third kiss, but the kind that comes after all the numbered ones. The kiss that doesn't count because it's no longer notable, because it has become the ordinary thing, the thing that happens in libraries in the evenings when two people who have chosen each other completely are simply being in a room together. The best kind. I told Alina the next morning. She was at her canvas, the crest painting, large and warm and taking shape with the patient attention of someone who has decided that getting it right matters more than getting it done. She listened to me tell her without interrupting, and when I finished, she set down her brush and looked at me with the expression I'd come to love. The direct, assessing, entirely honest gaze that was her version of being present. "Good," she said. "That's all." "What else should I say?" She picked up her brush. "I have been waiting for this since October. I am running out of things to paint. I need new subjects." I laughed. She smiled, the private smile, the real one. "Will you miss your apartment?" she asked, still painting. "Probably," I said. "The wolf stain." She looked at me. "A stain on the ceiling," I said. "Shaped like a wolf. I decided it was a lucky sign when I moved in." Was it? I thought about it. About 4 years in 3 rooms in Brooklyn, alone and making things and building the life that Ohio couldn't hold. About a wrong elevator button. About everything after. "Yes," I said, "it was." She nodded. She painted. The crest took shape on the canvas, the winter version, the November light, the room with the old glass windows. "Violet," she said after a while. "Yes." "The portrait, of you. I want to give it to you when I finish it." I looked at her. "Why?" "Because I painted it to understand you," she said. "And I understand you now, and the painting belongs to the person it understands." I thought about this, about the portrait she'd started in the chair by the window in the specific November light, the face she'd drawn from weeks of watching, the image of me that she had, somehow, made truer than a photograph. "Thank you," I said. "Don't thank me," she said. "Make something worthy of it." The echo was deliberate. She was smiling when she said it, the private smile, knowing I would recognize it. Adrian's words the first time he'd thanked me for the studio. "Don't thank me, make something worthy of it." I laughed. She painted. Outside the 17th floor window, the city was doing its April things. We were both, I thought, exactly where we were supposed to be. Chapter 7. The Architecture of After. Adrian, the same week. He stood in the crest, for the first time since the property transfer. Alone, Violet had a meeting in the city. Alina was in her studio. And he had driven up on a weekday morning with the specific intention of standing in the building without agenda, without the documentation team or the restoration assessors or any other professional purpose. Just standing in it. He had not done this before. Every previous visit had been purposeful. The research, the documentation, the trips with Violet when the visits were about the installation materials. He had never simply been here. He moved through the rooms slowly. The low rooflines his mother had designed against the prevailing preference for height. Height announces. Low roofs invite. She told him once when he was 12, and he'd asked why their house was so different from the ones in the development down the road. The windows placed for light rather than symmetry. A window that doesn't serve the light is a wall that hasn't decided what it is. The floors, the beams, the structural decisions that were simultaneously practical and philosophical, the building, and the thinking the same thing. He came to the room at the back, the room with the floor-to-ceiling windows. Spring light was coming through the old glass. It was different from the November light he'd stood in with Violet, warmer, more direct, the sun at a different angle, the trees outside beginning their return. The glass did the same thing with it that it had always done, bent it, fractured it, gave it back transformed. He stood in the room for a long time. He thought about his mother, not the story of her. The story was something he'd been telling and retelling for 15 years, the archive of it in the basement, the public record now filed and acknowledged. He thought about her specifically, the person, the way she'd moved through buildings she was designing, with the quality of attention she'd given everything she considered worth considering. The way she described the crest to him before it was finished, Not a building, Adrian. A conversation. Between what the land is saying and what we want to answer. He was 34 years old, and his mother had been dead for 15 years, and there were still things she'd said that arrived in him with the force of first hearing. He thought, I have her building. He thought, I have her building, and I have the installation in my building that is made from her building, and I have the woman who understood what the materials were saying before I could tell her, and I have Alina, who is alive. He thought she would say, good, now what are you going to build next? Because that was also who she was. She did not rest on what was made. She asked what came after. He thought about after. After was Violet in the penthouse, not as a managed arrangement, not as a controlled variable in his life, but as a person who had her own studio and her own conditions and her own work, and was choosing, with full information and clear eyes, to share his space. The conditions she'd named the studio, the London commission, the Brooklyn apartment held for 6 months, the asking not the arranging were exactly right. They were the conditions of someone who knew their own value and would not diminish it for comfort. He had agreed to every condition without negotiation, because every condition was correct. Because the version of love that required conditions to be right was the version worth having. After was Alina with her recovered body, and her crest painting and her walks that were getting longer. 3 blocks extended to 5, extended to 8, the city returning to her incrementally. After was Nora, who had been excellent for 8 years, and whom he had decided, finally, to say this to directly. The conversation yesterday afternoon, the specific acknowledgement of the specific quality of what she'd done, her expression when he said it, which was the expression of someone receiving something they hadn't known they were waiting for. After was the crest restoration, which would take years and would be extraordinary. The Preservation Trust had engaged the architect already, a young woman who worked, like his mother had, primarily with reclaimed materials. He had found this out after the fact. It was not a coincidence he had arranged. It was a coincidence that felt like something else, the particular coincidence of the world choosing correctly when you have been patient enough to wait for it. After was the work he hadn't started yet. He had spent 15 years with a specific plan and a specific purpose. The plan had concluded. The purpose had been served. He was 34, and he had a company and a building and an installation and a crest and an Alina and a Violet and the question that his mother would have asked. Now what are you going to build next? He didn't know yet. This was new. For 15 years he had known. The knowing had been the engine of everything, the certainty about the destination, which allowed the certainty about the direction, which allowed the certainty about each next step. He had been the most certain person he knew, in the deepest possible sense of certainty, and the certainty had served him. He did not know what came next. He stood in the room with the old glass and the spring light and the building around him that his mother had made, and he did not know what came next, and this was, he searched for the word. Free, he thought, this is what free feels like. Not the freedom of having no obligations. He had more obligations now than he'd had at any point. Violet's conditions, which were commitments. Alina's access to this building, which was a promise. The Preservation Trust, which was a responsibility. Nora, whom he'd acknowledged and therefore committed to continuing to see clearly. The freedom of having done the thing he set out to do. Of arriving at the place where the next choice had not yet been made, and could be made from a position that was not driven by the unfinished business of grief. He thought, I can build anything now. He thought, I want to build something she would have loved. He thought, I'll ask Violet. He smiled in the empty room. The light moved through the old glass. Outside, the spring trees were making their quiet decision to return. He stayed in the building for another hour. He looked at every room with the attention of someone seeing them for the first time, not the 15-year-old attention of someone fighting to preserve, but the 34-year-old attention of someone free to appreciate. Then he drove back to the city. To the building. To the woman in the studio on the 18th floor, who would look up when he came in with the specific quality of attention that was her version of welcome, and ask what he was thinking, and listen to the answer with her full analytical intelligence and her honest response, and say something that was truer than what he'd said. to the life that had arrived, finally, without being engineered. He drove south toward the city, and the late April afternoon was warm, and the Hudson was silver beside him, and he thought, this is enough. He thought, this is more than enough. He thought, let's see what we make next. End of part 7. Cliffhanger. She found the letter in her sketchbook on a Saturday morning in May. Not from Cresswell. The Cresswell chapter was closed, the settlement signed. The legal record public and permanent. This letter was in Adrian's handwriting. It was dated 4 years earlier. Before the installation, before the photographs, before the wrong floor. Before they had ever been in the same room. It was addressed to the gallery, where what we left in the rooms had shown. It was an inquiry, formal, precise, the language of a collector, asking for the artist's contact information. Dated 18 months before the group show in March. 18 months before he claimed to have first seen her work. He had been looking for her. For 4 years.